When I was 8 or 9, I saw something weird on Christmas Eve. This was many, many years ago, but I still remember it very clearly. I still believed in Santa Claus then, as a good amount of children do, and I had the usual anxiety and excitement for Santa to leave Christmas presents by the tree. After I went to bed, I had some trouble falling asleep with holiday nerves and such. I had finally drifted off when I woke up to the sound of soft footsteps somewhere in my room. I automatically assumed it was Santa Claus, and I was scared to see him for fear that he might leave or his magic would fail. I opened one eye just barely and saw this black figure standing over my bed, staring at me. It was tall, probably around 6 feet tall, and was completely dark. It almost looked blacker than the black consuming the room. I couldn't see any eyes, a mouth, or a nose on it, but I could clearly see the outline of a head, arms, body, and legs. It looked like a bigger person, so thinking it was Santa just made sense. It stayed in one spot for 10, maybe 15 seconds, until it took a few steps closer. It leaned in a little bit more, still a few feet away from me, and then stayed there for another 10 or 15 seconds. Even though I couldn't see a face, I knew that it was looking right at me. It's just that weird feeling that you get when you know that you're being watched or looked at. I closed my eyes again, waited for a few minutes. When I looked back, it was gone. I lived in a pretty old house at the time, so the doors and the floorboards were creaky and loud. I heard the footsteps, but I never heard the door open. I never saw this figure again, though I've had some other spooky experiences in that house. I asked my mom if she heard Santa when he came into my room last night. She looked confused for a second, and then she just played along, assuming I was lying. I know this wasn't a person. I know it wasn't a dream. And of course I know now it wasn't Santa. But I also know that spirits or entities are often attracted to lots of excitement and energy. So, Christmas would be the perfect time for a ghost to pass through. I bought one of those Christmas song-themed microphones, right? It was one where you could press the button and it would play the North Pole radio. Had all of these cool sound effects and stuff. It was cute and like $5, so I bought it. Well, if you hold down the button, you can talk into it, and when it plays it back, the pitch is all high. Your voice sounds like a chipmunk. You know what I mean. Anyway, I was playing with it one day a few months ago with my daughter, who's 6 months at the time. She's not paying much attention, so I'm talking into the microphone, trying to get her to look over at me. Well, I go to play it back, and instead of stopping at the end of the recording, the ambient white noise, shifted slightly, and I swear to God, something started to speak. The only clear word I got was my name, and like I said, it's supposed to alter your pitch higher, and this voice was deep. I fucking freaked out, threw it away outside, called my boyfriend, asked him to come home early that day. Some people might say this wasn't exactly paranormal, but it was awful. When I was little, my town put together a Santa's Village type spot for the kids, but I use that term loosely. The only good thing about it was the reindeer. Everything else was pretty tacky. It doesn't snow here, so they would lay down patches of white felt and paint hay bales like snowmen. There was a food truck with gross hot dogs but decent hot chocolate, an ornament stand, a few trees with lights, and some carnival-style games. Each year, fewer people would go to the point that they talked about not having it anymore. The final year that it was open, I was 8, and they tried to do something special to bring people back, so they got a carousel. One of those huge blow-up slides, and a bunch of kiddie rides like that. Everything was decorated in a Christmas theme with garlands, ribbon, whatever else you could find. We ran into my cousin by the reindeer, so she and I went to check out the rides while our parents talked. There was a kiddie roller coaster, like the kind that usually has a dragon or caterpillar for cars, but this one had a bunch of painted cardboard taped around it, made it look like Santa's sleigh. The line wasn't long, but we had to wait a few minutes, and it was really awkward because the girl behind us was fighting with her dad. She looked about 5 or 6 and came up at the same time that we did. A minute later, her dad showed up and said that they had to leave, but the girl didn't want to. When he saw us looking at them, he apologized for bothering us and told the girl that she was disturbing everyone's good time. The girl was trying to pull her arm away from her dad, really starting to throw a tantrum. My cousin is younger and looked a little scared, so I was distracted by talking to her about the rides. I didn't really hear anything else specific. One more screaming kid was basically white noise at that place. Next thing I knew, we were getting on the ride, and the girl wasn't behind us anymore. Our parents met us when we got off. We stopped to get hot chocolate, and when we were sitting down, we started hearing more and more people calling out for Beverly. A woman approached us and said that a little girl was missing. She described exactly what the girl behind us was wearing. When my cousin and I told them that her dad had taken her home, they called the police. We told our story at least 50 times before I finally figured out why it was such a big deal. The guy hadn't been her father. One of the few things I remembered her saying was, "I don't want to go with you." I thought that she just didn't want to leave. It seemed so normal when it was happening. We described the man as best we could, but we never agreed on many details. We've talked about it many times over the years, and our descriptions sound like two totally different people. Our parents tried to hide what happened to her, but I saw it on the news a week later, and I told my cousin. They'd found the girl's body the next day. She'd been thrown in a landfill. As far as I know, they never caught the guy. I know it's illogical to blame myself. No one was surprised that 2 kids didn't intervene. We weren't even the only ones who noticed them. Other witnesses saw them struggling as he got her into a car, and they didn't do anything either. As an adult, I hear how absurd it sounds to expect more from my 8-year-old self, but I still can't totally shake it off. Needless to say, no one argued when there was no village the next year. So growing up, I went to Catholic school, and we celebrated St. Nicholas Day in the beginning of December. The tradition goes that you leave your shoes out, and St. Nicholas, aka your parents, will leave presents in them. When I was in elementary school one year, the day after St. Nicholas Day, my friend came into school all excited. The night before, he saw St. Nicholas in his room, putting presents in his shoes. He described him as having a big white beard, putting something in his left shoe before leaving. At the time, we were excited because it proved to us that Santa was real. 20 years later, I'm having some beers with this friend. We hadn't seen each other in a long time. He moved shortly after elementary school. We're buzzed and telling old stories, and I bring up the St. Nicholas Day story. I ask him if it really happened. Very nonchalantly, he goes, "Yeah, dude, it did. But it wasn't St. Nicholas. That was a ghost." He basically tells me that his old house was built in the 1700s and was definitely haunted by one of the original owners. He said that night he woke up to see an old man with a long white beard tugging at his foot. When my friend saw him, the old man waved and then floated up through the ceiling. He hadn't left anything in his shoe. I guess it took my friend several years for the experience to sink in, and now it scares the hell out of him. When he was younger, he assumed that the man tugging at his foot was St. Nicholas. But now, and as he got older, that clearly wasn't the case. A side note, my aunt and uncle were moving a couple of years ago and were actually considering buying my friend's old house. I told them this story, and they completely dropped interest in that place. Thankfully for them. Here's one for the Yuletide log that we truly don't share enough when my family gathers to tell stories around Christmas time. Probably because the little fiasco almost got me taken away from my dad and put into foster care because of how negligent it made him look as a parent. And so here's the story of how I got to take a magical ride with Santa and one of his elves when they carjacked my dad's Jeep from a gas station parking lot in the early Christmas morning hours of 1994. I was about 5 at the time, and my dad delivered papers for the Seattle Times. He was a single father and couldn't leave me at the apartment unattended for the hours it took him to deliver papers. So he made me a small bed in the back of his Jeep. He rigged it up so that I was still seatbelted in, kind of like a hospital gurney, but homemade with only 3 straps to secure my hip area, chest, and legs. I could still turn and move, but I was secured in at the same time. Pretty ingenious technology. It would be his routine to get a coffee halfway through his deliveries when his favorite 7-Eleven was closest on his route. If I was awake, he'd get me a donut. Most of the time I'd be asleep though. That night, I was asleep. There was snow on the ground, and the temperatures were at their lowest during that part of the night. When my dad got to the 7-Eleven, he left the car on to keep the heater running for me without killing his already unreliable battery. He's never seen the person working behind the register, and while he's purchasing his coffee, she starts to put the moves on him, and they both begin to flirt back and forth. While my dad's distracted by his new Juliet, a man dressed as Santa Claus rides up on his bike. Then, out of the dark, another man rides up beside him, dressed as an elf, minus the pointy shoes. They dump their bikes and briefly talk with each other before slowly approaching the driver and passenger side doors while continuing to scan the parking lot. That's what the building's security camera captured anyway. Change to my perspective. Boom. The doors on both sides of the Jeep swing open. I feel a rush of cold wind hit the top of my head and my feet. Then both doors slam shut, and I hear 2 unfamiliar voices laughing and frantically shouting profanities back and forth. I was quickly slid forward and then backward. I recognized the Jeep was going fast enough for me to feel pressed against the back seats. The harness my dad had built was really being put to the test, because Santa drove like a bat out of hell. I woke up confused and scared. I was seeing Santa Claus behind the wheel, and it only furthered my confusion. I could only bend up a little, but it was clearly Santa that I was looking at. I could see even less of the elf, but he was also dressed the part. He was the same size as Santa, and in retrospect, it's funny that their size comparison was the first red flag of something being wrong. Probably still thinking I was dreaming, I go, "Santa?" The front seats get quiet real quick, and I watch his eyes meet mine in the rearview mirror, and he says, "What the fuck?" Then the elf turns and looks at me, then turns to Santa and starts cussing at him, calling him Wayne. I got squeezed and launched forward the 6 inches my harness allowed as the Jeep's brakes slammed. The tires skid to a stop, and the smell of burnt rubber when they open their doors flooded in, and I feel the rush of cold wind enter the vehicle. I hear the doors at my feet open and think Santa's going to unstrap me. Then the door at my head pops open, and I get a closer look at the elf. He's mid to late 30s, thick, bushy eyebrows, blue eyes, brown hair falling from his green, pointy hat. He looked at me and then up at Santa and says a few comments indicating that I may have a disability, and that's why I'm strapped into this contraption so tightly. They would actually be witnesses against my dad in his legal battle later on, telling the state I was leashed in the back of a Jeep like a dog. The men didn't know how to free me, so they unstrapped and pulled apart the actual sleeping board from the seats, with me still harnessed to it. They'd pull the whole thing out and leave me in the snow in some neighborhood by Lake Forest Park. I almost died of hypothermia. Nobody would have thought to look for me separate from the Jeep, let alone in some random neighborhood miles away. Thankfully, the sun was about to be up, and my screams alerted someone in one of the houses who came out to find me in between their recycling bins. Therapists out there, give me some advice free of charge. Each reply will be like a Christmas present I can gleefully unwrap. By continuing further, you legally agree to help, so here goes. My mother-in-law was an old, mean, sickly woman. I thought she was showing signs of dementia, but my husband never pressed to get her checked. She'd been living with us for around 9 months. Her residence at the senior facility that we were paying for, it had been revoked at the beginning of the year after she'd almost set her apartment on fire with a lit cigarette. In September, she committed suicide off the banister of our staircase. I know that sounds crazy. Maybe she fell over the railing and it was an accident, but I watched her do it. I had no clue that she was going to jump. We'd been arguing about something silly. I think she was accusing me of stealing the fish from the large circular tank in her room. It had me heated enough to where I had to storm out. She was following behind me, still yelling. I turned to walk down the stairs to the first floor. She stays at the top area, shouting down at me. Then she quieted down real quick. I turned around thinking that she'd given herself a heart attack. But I see her glancing around, almost like there's a bat swooping around her head. She stood up real straight, made a really heavy, slow inhale before pressing her stomach against the railing, where she then spun over the railing, falling straight down like an arrow into the ground of our entry room. The floorboards shook under me with the drop. I've never seen something as terrible as what I witnessed that afternoon, and nobody knows why she did it. It was hard to console my husband and deal with the repeating horror movie in my head. He would want to talk about her and mourn, but her name only brought disgusting images to the forefront of my mind. We're both still trying to help each other while struggling to help ourselves. On top of that, days later, and I'm talking a matter of 24, 36 hours after her death, weird stuff started happening around the house. We have pictures that line the wall of our staircase leading up to the bedrooms. That next night, all of them were crooked, all leaning the same direction. My husband told me that he's heard her talking in her bedroom. We still haven't cleared her stuff out. Some family's been by to take some things, but for the most part, her room's been left untouched. I think I'll be more insistent about us going through it after the new year. It's only been a few months, and it's been hard enough handling her cremation, all while sorting out her accounts and bills. We still feel her living here, like she's never left. We've both heard footsteps approach the room that we're in, just to have no one enter. As much as I've tried to deny what's going on, I've seen our curtains blow around with no wind present. None of the other plants or papers around it move. And yet, I watch the curtains make shapes of waves with the fabric. I believe now that something is going on, and I worry that these things will just keep escalating. A few days ago, all of our burners were turned on. When we got home from work, our entire house was filled with gas. It took us hours to air the place out. During the summer, my husband promised our house to the rest of the family to celebrate Christmas. I absolutely don't feel comfortable hosting family over with all this stuff escalating. But we gotta do something. I've narrowed it down to this. Cancel Christmas plans with my husband's family 4 or 5 days before Christmas. Or desperately try to find someone to exorcise his mom out of our house. So, which would you pick? This happened just before Christmas 2019, and I guess it popped into my mind again recently due to it being Christmas season. December 2019, I was traveling by train back to my hometown. When I arrived at the train platform, I started walking toward the ticket machines. As I approached, there was an attendant standing by the machines. As soon as he turned and saw me, he loudly said to me, "Well, finally, you're here. I've been waiting 30 years for you to show up." I thought that was a very weird thing to say, especially since I was only 21 at the time. At a guess, the attendant was in his 50s. The way he said it was very happy and sincere, not sarcastic or even in a joking tone. Unfortunately, I was very shy and awkward, so I didn't ask what he meant. Now I wish I had. Then he asked if he could help me with anything, so I asked him to help me buy a ticket, as I'd never used the ticket machines before. As I was buying the ticket, he kept making really intense eye contact and looking at my face as if he recognized me and was trying to figure out if I was who he thought I was. I had only moved to the area 3 months before and have no family there, so he couldn't have mistaken me for an older relative of mine. I had definitely never seen him before, and it was my first time taking that train. Throughout the interaction, he asked me, "Are you going on another business trip?" Again, I was confused because I was clearly a 21-year-old student, not a businesswoman. I feel that I should say that he wasn't creepy at all, and he definitely wasn't hitting on me. He was well-spoken and clearly not intoxicated. So here's the glitch. After I bought my ticket, he picked up my suitcase and walked me to the train, which was very kind of him. I stepped into the train. He placed my suitcase next to me. I turned to thank him, and he was gone. It was like as soon as he let go of my suitcase, he vanished into thin air. There was practically no one else around, so he didn't disappear into a crowd or anything like that. I glanced all around, and I couldn't see him anywhere. He definitely did not get on the train with me and wasn't anywhere on the platform. If he had run off, I would have heard his footsteps, and it wasn't enough time for him to disappear from sight, even if he was running. The whole situation felt so strange. Not paranormal exactly, but surreal. Maybe I should mention that even though I was in university, I'd never been drunk or tried drugs. I wasn't sleep deprived. I say this because there wasn't an easy explanation, such as me imagining him disappearing or anything. Any theories on what it could have been? He seemed to recognize me and think that I was someone from his past. So maybe some kind of time slip. I don't know. Thanks for reading. Let's take a journey back in time to when I was just a little kid. A memory that I tend to go back to every Christmas, whether I like it or not. Memories are fun that way. So I'll share with you a less than jolly time I had being part of the incredible Toys for Tots program. This is no knock to the program, by the way. Those folks made my Christmases less bleak, for real. Love them. That being said, just imagine stepping into an environment where the air literally crackles with anticipation, filled with that childlike laughter, and in this case, the irresistible aroma of freshly baked cookies. My mom was waiting in line for our cookies while I stood to the side, mesmerized by all the twinkling lights and vibrant decorations, all leading to an even grander area, a stage fit for none other than the jolliest man himself, Santa Claus. This was the first year I remember being excited to see Santa. I'd met him at the mall briefly the year before, but I wanted a redo. My mom told me that I'd seen him years before that too, but this year it felt like I was encountering a rock star. Finally, I was in line, eating my cookies and bouncing with excitement. Clearly, I wasn't the only one. Dozens of anxious kids squirmed with the same anticipation, all eagerly waiting our turn to perch on the big guy's lap and pour out our biggest wishes. I don't know if it was pure childhood imagination, but I swear, I saw an enchanting aura surrounding Santa. I remember thinking, this guy holds the key to happiness. But then, in the blink of an eye, The atmosphere shattered into absolute chaos. The once merry mood transformed into sheer pandemonium as Santa appeared to kneel over, clutching his chest. Santa just had a heart attack in front of dozens of kids. Panic and shock ripped through the crowd like a tidal wave, eventually hitting my mom and I, her face changing from just general mom face to something that I'd never seen before, fear of some kind. It scared me. I switched my view back to Santa and the crowd. All of those gleeful expressions had turned to horror. Everyone looked as scared as my mom. Worried parents fretted over the man in the red suit, shielding the children's eyes, rushing for the exit, carrying and consoling in every direction. I vividly recall the feeling of my mom grasping my hand, her face drained of color, worry etched into every line of her face, and with urgency she swiftly whisked me away from the unfolding scene. She too was shielding me from the distressing sight, though I could still see it. When we left, Santa laid on the ground, motionless. Someone, not an elf, but just a regular person, was performing CPR. I didn't know what that was at the time, but I made my mom explain everything. We left the parking lot in a hurry before the arrival of the ambulance, yet the image of Santa clutching his chest, it lingered in my thoughts. So the question started. Had I just seen Santa die? No, of course not. As my mom explained to me, every Santa that I'd ever encountered was merely a decoy, messengers of the true Santa Claus. I hadn't witnessed the final moments of Santa himself. Instead, I'd witnessed a messenger of Santa's experience a life-threatening emergency. My mom reminded me that night that being Santa is no easy task. As a child, I could accept that. I really didn't want to believe Santa had died. Despite the somber note attached to my story, the experience sort of ignited a newfound appreciation for the magic of Christmas when I was a child. Sure, that wore off when I found out the real magic of Christmas. Then the story was just sad. But for a while there, I truly believed that I had this inside scoop into Santa and his workshop of decoys. Today I had lunch with an old friend from college, and our conversation gave me doubts about how I've handled Christmas with my daughter. She basically called me an asshole. I'm starting to worry that she was right, so I wanted to get more opinions. My 2 kids are 1 and 6, and I never let the 6-year-old believe in Santa. She's always known he isn't real. She still gets the same amount of presents and enjoys the same movies. She's just never sat on Santa's lap or wrote him letters. I've never thought of it as wrong or bad, only different. But now my friend is behaving as if I've robbed her of some childhood rite of passage. I could technically do things differently with my 1-year-old, but the mere thought of doing so terrifies me to my core. The reason I don't want my kids to believe in Santa is because of my own childhood experience, but maybe that isn't fair. I was a cliché, spoiled, only child, so Christmas was my favorite time of year. I always wrote Santa letters, left thank you cards with his milk and cookies, and tried to stay awake at night, but I inevitably fell asleep. Except for one year. When I was 7, I woke up to see Santa coming through our back door. We didn't have a fireplace, so I assumed that's how things worked for kids without chimneys. I was bouncing with excitement, and he rushed over, urging me to be quiet, lest wake my parents. I clamped my hands over my mouth, not wanting to upset him, but I could barely contain myself. He sat on the couch and had me sit on his lap while he ate the cookies and read my thank you card. I remember thinking he smelled bad, but it wasn't enough to set off my alarm bells. Then, when I asked for my presents, he said that he forgot them in the sleigh and invited me to come pet his reindeer. I had to clamp both hands over my mouth, again, to contain the squeal that rose to my lips. Once I regained control, he took my hand and led me outside, where no sleigh waited on the roof. Instead, He took me to an old, beat-up station wagon, parked at the curb. I stopped dead in my tracks, confused and upset. But he said it was disguised with magic. After all, he couldn't very well just leave his reindeer alone on the street, or someone might steal them. To a 7-year-old, that made all the sense in the world. But then he said that he would have to drive me somewhere private in order to release the spell, or someone else might see. I said I couldn't leave without telling my parents, but he knew a place that we could go, just around the corner. He said we wouldn't be gone for more than 10 minutes. I was afraid of getting into trouble, but how could I pass up a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to pet Santa's actual reindeer? I finally agreed to go, and he once again began leading me to this hideous station wagon. But just when he was opening the door for me, a set of bright headlights turned onto our quiet, dead-end street. We were the second house, so it was already close to us when they turned. And I quickly recognized our neighbor's truck because he had the green glow lights along the bottom on each side. Santa let go of my hand and stood frozen, turned away from the lights. I thought they hurt his eyes, but later understood that he was hiding his face. I'm not sure if he was waiting to see what the truck did, or if he was just debating whether or not to snatch me and run. But at the time, I just wanted to show off that I'd met Santa, so I began jumping and waving as I called out, "Mr. Johnson, look, it's Santa!" I knew him well because he often came to our barbecues, and the second I began calling to him, Santa took off running, jumped in the car, and sped away. Mr. Johnson drove all the way into our yard, leapt out of his truck, and ran over to me. I was crying my eyes out, screaming for Santa to come back. I thought that he was mad at me, and now I wouldn't get any presents. Mr. Johnson picked me up, carried me inside where he woke my parents and told them everything. It was total chaos. Police were called, descriptions were taken, and I was informed that there's no such thing as Santa. My parents were even more traumatized than me, and they never wanted to risk anything like that happening again. Our neighbor was praised as a hero, and rightfully so. I still send him a Christmas and birthday card every year, even though he moved to Michigan after I graduated high school. They did catch the guy who tried to kidnap me. He tried to take another little girl from a neighborhood across town. Her parents woke up before he could get her outside, and the father put him in the hospital. He spent some time in jail, but not nearly long enough, and I have no idea what happened to him after that. So yeah, he's the reason I never told my daughter about Santa Claus. I had put serious thought into doing things differently with my son. I've been seeing a therapist for 2 years now, and I've learned better coping techniques for my anxiety. Then my conversation with my friend almost convinced me. Honestly, I'd hoped that sharing this story might have a healing effect, like it would be the last leg of this tiring journey. But I think it did the opposite. There should be no reason my son can't have the same magical holiday experience as my daughter. When it comes to all the things that make Christmas special, Santa is a pretty small piece of the equation. I still welcome and appreciate all opinions, but I may have made up my own mind. Well, thank you for reading anyway, and whatever traditions you celebrate at this time of year, I hope you have the happiest holiday yet. I've heard this story so many times, but I honestly never thought it would happen to me. Last night, I was doing some Christmas shopping alone at the local TJ Maxx. I, 35-year-old female, rarely ever go shopping alone, especially in the evening. Usually I'll have my kids or my husband. I'm browsing around aimlessly, kinda just all over the store, not sure what I'm gonna get yet. I see this young guy, probably early 20s, skinny, with glasses. I didn't think anything of it. Went to a different spot. See him again. He's in the same aisle, picking stuff up to look at and putting it back. No cart or anything. My red flags were not raised yet. Then I see him a third time in a different area. doing the same thing, but now stopping and texting someone. My senses start to perk up a bit, like, okay, this is weird, but I'm not nervous yet, per se. But I'm more aware. Then it happens again, and this time I know something is weird. He's following me all over the store and has nothing to buy. So I kind of start zigzagging through the store, and I find a coat that I want to try on. At this point, I was very wary, but I was also thinking I'm being ridiculous and paranoid. But I just had this strong sense that this was not normal. I went into the dressing room for about 15 minutes, hoping I would lose him. I came out and I didn't see him for another 20-ish minutes. I was relieved, thinking I was definitely being paranoid and he probably left. I go to the checkout after almost an hour and a half of shopping with a cart full of stuff. I was the only one in line. I got called to cash out and I turn around and this man is immediately behind me in the checkout. He came out of nowhere. He had one item, some cheap little decoration. At this point, I was full on panicking. The cashier could tell that I was being weird and was very distracted. At the risk of sounding crazy, I almost didn't say anything. But I told her, I think this man is following me. She was extremely empathetic and didn't seem very surprised. She was like, I'm so sorry. I'll have someone walk you to your car. I was so thankful for her kindness. The man checked out with his one item and left the store with an older man who I didn't see before. The older man had nothing that he bought. The parking lot at this store is a huge, dark plaza. I did not want to go outside alone. I just knew it was a very bad idea. The cashier asked another employee to walk me out. She was younger than me, but so sweet. I apologized profusely because it was sleeting and cold rain. She had no coat on. She said, I don't care if it's downpouring. I would still walk you to your car. It was so sweet, really. She walked me all the way and even waited until I pulled out and drove away. The whole time I was shaking like a leaf. Like I said, I've heard this happen to so many women, but I kind of just thought that I might be being paranoid, exaggerating. This was extremely scary, though. The more I think about it, the creepier it gets. He followed me around the entire store. Everywhere I turned, there he was. I have no idea what his deal was, but this was so unsettling. My husband freaked out, doesn't want me going shopping alone anymore. I don't really want to shop alone anymore either. If I had not been paying attention or dismissed my bad feelings, something bad may have happened. As a woman, being aware of our surroundings is so important. I'm currently 36, divorced, and living in Nebraska, but I'm originally from South Dakota and still going back to spend Christmas with my parents. Except after what happened last year, I really don't want to go this year, especially not for the entire week. They left the suburbs for a bigger house in a rural area with lots of woods, and it's beautiful, but it's also friggin' terrifying. At first, I thought not having any neighbors was a plus. But now I'm constantly worried about them being out there all alone with whatever's in those woods. The cell service is shit too, so they can't even reliably call for help without sitting in a window. Last year I went up the Monday before Christmas weekend. It was pretty late when I got there, and right away I knew my parents were acting strange. They were jumping at every little sound and rushing me inside. I wasn't even allowed to unload the car. Dad was in the military for over 30 years. It takes a lot just to rattle him. So to see him actually afraid was truly concerning. But he and Mom kept insisting nothing was wrong. The next morning, they were back to their old selves, so I chalked it up to my late arrival and pushed it from my mind. until the same thing happened that night as well. It was to the point where I started searching the local news stations to see if there was some kind of serial killer or escaped convict on the loose. But again, I got nothing. Thursday night was my breaking point. After realizing I'd left my charger in the car, I tried to go get it, but I was locked inside. Both doors had locks that could only be opened with a key. When I asked for it, Mom gave me her charger instead. Just to see what they would do, I said I still needed my purse, and they both went rigid. Finally, I threatened to crawl through a window, and Dad said that he would get it himself. Then he opened the coat closet, grabbed his shotgun, and began peering out the windows. If Mom weren't behaving the same way, I would have thought that he was having flashbacks or something. I stopped him from going out. I didn't actually need anything else, and I couldn't stand seeing them both so frightened, but I did give them an ultimatum. Either they came clean, or I left for home first thing in the morning, because I no longer felt comfortable being there. When they finally told me, I didn't know what to think. Mom has always been a little superstitious, and she loves her ghost hunting shows, but Dad mocks anyone who believes in that stuff, like they should be locked in a padded cell. To hear him now say that a monster lived in their woods, that unto itself was terrifying. They had their first experience only 3 days after moving in. One of the main reasons Mom wanted to retire to the country was because she's obsessed with a couple of YouTube channels with raccoons. She planned to leave food by the woods and move it closer to the house as her new friends grew accustomed to her. Anyway, on the third night, Mom looked outside to see if anything had found the food, and she saw something looking at it from just inside the tree line. They hadn't had time to install the floodlights, but it looked to be the size of a raccoon standing up, so she got excited and called Dad over to watch too. Nothing happened for a few minutes, as if it was afraid of stepping into the open, but then the creature they believed to be standing on its hind legs suddenly stretched to its full height. It had only been crouching before, and now the shadowy creature stood taller than a grown man. The clear sky provided just enough light to see that it was definitely covered in fur, and a long arm reached out to pull back a branch blocking its way. Mom screamed, and the figure's head turned towards the house with a low growl before taking off through the woods. Mom believed it was Bigfoot, but Dad thought that it was some jackass in a costume, and he was pissed. He called the police, but they didn't want to send someone as nothing had actually happened, and no one was in immediate danger. The next morning, Dad went to look at the spot where they saw it, and they found huge footprints with only 4 toes on each. He wears a size 12. His own foot was swallowed by this thing's tracks, but what really confused him was how deep they were. If any regular person had worn something in order to make those prints, they wouldn't have been nearly as deep. Likewise, if someone had simply pressed something into the ground, it would have also appeared differently, and the perpetrator would have left their real tracks behind as well. The floodlights went up the next day, but nothing out of the ordinary happened for 3 more weeks. By then, they'd pretty much forgotten about the incident entirely, and Mom had finally gotten a couple of raccoons to come see her each night. Pebbles and Bam Bam wouldn't let her get close yet, but she was working on it. Well, they were showing up at pretty much the same time each night, but now they were suddenly nowhere to be found. Finally, she peeked out of the window and saw the creature eating the raccoon's steak fat and rib bones with its hands, like a person. She managed to stifle her scream and get Dad before it finished. Oh, and don't worry about Pebbles and Bam Bam, though. They went on to have a big family, and they visit all the time, but only when it's actually safe to do so. Anyway, Dad grabbed his shotgun and ran out onto the porch, still thinking that it was a person. He screamed for them to leave, or he would shoot. The creature dropped the food, turned towards him, and let out a guttural growl that sent chills down his spine. Its mouth opened wide to reveal a black tongue and huge yellow teeth. He said it almost looked like a gorilla, except it was built like a person, and it had big bald spots all over, like it had mange. That's when he realized it wasn't a costume, because no human could ever make a sound like that. He raised the shotgun as the creature charged and fired a round directly into its chest, but it just kept coming. He got inside, slammed the door, just as it leapt onto the porch. For almost 20 minutes, it scratched and banged on the door, before finally leaving. Dad called the police again, but knew better than to say they were being attacked by a monster. So he stuck with his costume story. They arrived a few minutes after the creature left, and only then did Dad go back outside. The officers didn't know what to make of the heavy doors, deep gashes, and splintered wood, but they took pictures and made a report. That happened the Sunday after Thanksgiving, and luckily, my parents replaced the door the following day because the creature came back more often after that, like it had a personal vendetta against my dad. So yeah, fast forward to my arrival, and they were pretty on edge by then, but they spent a lot of their retirement money on fixing that place up. They couldn't and still can't afford to move, so they didn't want to worry me. I really don't know what I thought when they first told me. It's such a wild story to take in, especially from your completely normal family, but any doubts I had were completely erased when I saw it for myself on Christmas Eve. It was just like they said. You just can't understand something like that until you've experienced it firsthand. We were opening presents and having a nice night when there was suddenly an awful banging on the side of the house. My mom sat staring into space. Dad hugged his shotgun, and I very quietly snuck a peek out the window. I wish so much that I hadn't, but I needed to know for sure. After 10 or 15 minutes, it left, and I didn't see it again, but I hated leaving my parents there like that. In the years since, they've started putting food right inside the tree line every few days. Sometimes it will eat and leave, and sometimes it'll disappear entirely for months at a time. But they still have the occasional attack, and I am absolutely terrified of going back. They've gotten so used to it that they just keep insisting it's safe. But I just can't get on board with normalizing this insanity. I know I'll end up going in the end, but it makes me feel better to pretend I might not, and to finally get all of this off my chest, so thanks for listening. And Merry Christmas. Be safe out there, especially if you're traveling. Every Christmas, my parents make me go to my grandmother's house in Mississippi, and I hate sleeping there. They have one of those really old houses from the 1800s, and it's haunted as shit. My grandmother's lived there for over 25 years, and she's so used to it that she doesn't even react anymore. According to her, there's a little boy who died of pneumonia, a woman who died in childbirth, and something mean that she doesn't like. But the way she talks about it, you'd think that it was only an ornery squirrel in her attic. The little boy normally likes to run up and down the stairs and sometimes in the hallways, but when I'm there, he haunts the room I stay in all night. Grandma says he wants to play with me because there's never any other kids around, but I'd rather stick to friends that are living, thank you very much. God, I can already see the comments saying they'd love to play with a ghost. I'm sorry, but most of you wouldn't. You think it sounds cool until you woke up to pounding footsteps running around your bed in the middle of the night, and then you'd be freaked out, just like me. That shit isn't supposed to happen in real life. The woman cries a lot, but only at night and only in the room where she died. Grandma turned it into her craft room because no one can sleep in there. Sometimes she'll go in and stuff will be on the ground from where it fell off the desk or shelf. But that's about it for the woman. She doesn't know anything about the mean one. But she has a theory that it might be a Civil War soldier, because one used to live there. He had a reputation for being just as brutal at home as he was in battle, but he died in Gettysburg. So I'm not sure if he could be haunting the house or how that would work, but again, it's just the only theory she has. He's the one responsible for random cold spots appearing throughout the house, and he enjoys scaring people. Grandma always tells everyone to hold on to the handrails when they use the stairs because he's tried to push her down them on more than one occasion. He also messes with women more than men. Mom gets her hair pulled a lot when we're there. One Christmas, I fell asleep on the couch after opening presents and dreamed that I woke up to see a tall, black shadow leaning over me. I tried to scream, but couldn't. Then it stretched out its hand and scratched my chest. I woke up for real, screaming, and there were actual scratch marks across my chest. They weren't bleeding, but they were raised red welts about 6 inches long. The same thing has happened to Grandma enough times for her to think it wasn't a big deal. Last year we were watching The Grinch on Christmas Eve night, and the only source of light came from the tree and the TV. At one point, I noticed my dad staring at the tree really hard, and I tried to figure out what he could be looking at. Before I could notice anything, a shadowy arm reached out from a larger shadow on the wall and hit one of the ornaments. The glass ball fell to the hardwood floor and shattered, causing everyone else to jump. Dad and I were the only ones to see it, but no one was surprised by what happened. The next night, I almost ended Christmas Day by falling down the stairs myself. I wasn't pushed, but the stairs have a landing halfway up and then turn left. I was paying more attention to my switch than my surroundings, so when I turned, I was just inches away from the shadow figure. I don't even know how to describe what I did. I tried to stop, but it was so sudden that I was already on top of it and nearly fell over backwards trying to scramble away from it. The second I touched it, my body went cold, and I got dizzy and nauseous. I even dropped my new switch. That part really sucked. This incident is the main reason I don't want to go back. It's a whole year later now, but I still remember that awful feeling like it happened yesterday. It's bad enough just being there for a few days, but I don't know how my grandma can stand it. When she wakes up to that thing standing over her, she just screams at it to make it go away, like it's a child misbehaving. I asked if it really obeyed her, and she said, only sometimes. I asked what happens the other times, but she just patted me on the back and said, he gets angry. I'll never understand how she can be so calm about this shit. I'm sorry these examples are all over the place, but I've just kind of been writing down whichever one comes to mind, like the year 2 of Grandma's fingers were splinted because they got slammed in a door, or the time that Dad hurt his knee because something grabbed his ankle on the stairs when he was moving boxes into the cellar. But yeah, I think those are all the big ones. I wish I was one of those people who could enjoy this kind of stuff, but it's just not for me. I love my grandma, but I wish that she would come to our house for the holidays every now and then. I'm gonna end up with PTSD from going to hers. Hell, that's if I don't already have it. Every time we come home, I still spend weeks jumping at every noise while I readjust to being safe. Though I should probably just be grateful that nothing has followed us back. Anyway, thanks for reading and Merry Christmas. May you all have a better one than I'm going to. Okay, I know this sounds really bah humbug for me to say, but I'm ready for this holiday season to end. The only thing I've gotten for Christmas so far is a creepy stalker, so I'm pretty much done. Every year I pick up a little extra money by operating the camera for Santa at the mall. It's extremely easy. The camera sits on a tripod, the kid sits on Santa, and I click the button. The end. Most customers don't even notice me, but this year, one man in particular noticed me way too much. Once Barb takes the customer's money, she sends the kid up to sit on Santa's lap while the parents usually circle like vultures to snap a picture from every angle. Some of them stand a little too close for comfort, but it's usually because I'm invisible, not because they're being creeps. Over the years, I've learned to ignore them right back. Well, a couple of days ago, a little girl was with Santa, and her father stood next to me as he took his pictures. I noticed him after taking my own, and we exchanged the customary polite smiles. but then he didn't move along. Instead, he introduced himself and wished me a Merry Christmas, which I cheerfully returned, only to have him launch into a story about the little girl being his niece. He kept stressing the word as if it were really important that I didn't think she was his daughter. I continued smiling politely, but then Rick went on to explain that he had to bring her to see Santa because his brother was in the hospital with cancer, and the girl's mother had died in childbirth. If that's true, my heart bleeds for the poor girl. But, in my experience, when someone begins blabbing their life story to a stranger in such detail, it's either because they are so overwhelmed that it spills out of them involuntarily, or because they want a pat on the back while you fawn over what a great person they are. Or, of course, it's all a complete lie, because some disgusting man wants to get in your pants. This genuinely felt like the latter. I'm 29, and this guy is pushing at least 50. He also reeked of cigarettes and looked like he hadn't showered in a couple weeks. The little girl, bless her little heart, didn't appear as if she was being cared for properly at all. Her face and clothes were dirty, her hair wasn't brushed, and my chest ached for her. I hated to see Barb give Santa the 30-second warning, but her uncle was creeping me the hell out, and if we let every kid talk as long as they wanted, we would never get to them all. He saw the signal too, and asked if I would have dinner with him after my shift. Not wanting to be overly rude, I simply said that my boyfriend and I already had plans, but that wasn't good enough. An angry look flashed across his face that let me know that he was definitely unstable and not just an awkward man with poor hygiene. He actually argued that I couldn't know who I would like more if I didn't give him a chance. I didn't even try to hide my look of disgust, but he was so lost in his fantasy world he didn't even notice. Thankfully, the mall security guard did. I hadn't even realized it, but I'd been moving backwards as Rick came closer to the point that he was now in front of my camera, and I was out in the customer's area. The little girl was finished with Santa and watching us from the exit aisle, and the next kid was waiting for me to take a picture. Once Mike got rid of the weirdo, I explained what happened to Barb, and while I was doing that, Mike came back to share his own concerns. Once they were out of earshot, Rick had told him that I was his girlfriend, and that he was trying to see what time my shift ended. When Mike pretended not to know when I got off, the guy got belligerently angry and demanded that he find out. When I got off an hour later, a different security guard walked me to my car just to be safe, but we didn't see the guy. The next morning, Barb said that Rick had returned 10 minutes before closing and seemed to be looking for me, but left when I wasn't there. I was already freaking out, but then Rick showed up again around lunchtime. He said his niece hadn't been able to finish her wish list yet. To avoid a scene, and because all of our hearts broke for that poor kid, we let them stand in line. But I, quote-unquote, went on break the moment he was close enough to try to speak to me. Mike made it a point to take the pictures for me when I went to the employee break room, and Rick watched me like a hawk through the entire exchange. When it was his turn to go next and I still hadn't come back, he let the person behind him skip the line. Well, Mike, being the awesome guy that he is, wasn't going to play that shit. He very politely explained that I absolutely would not be returning while he was there, and that if he let one more person skip the line, they would be asked to leave and banned from returning. Rick tried the girlfriend story again, but Mike called him out on that too. Then the crazy bastard tried to say that we were just going through a rough patch, but he was here to apologize, and if I only knew that, I would want to talk to him. Rick turned red as a tomato and physically shook with anger as he pulled his niece out of line. She began crying and begging to see Santa one more time, but he kept going without so much as a glance down. I'm glad I didn't have to see it, but I wish so badly that that child didn't have to suffer because of her uncle, or whoever he is to her. Mike got off before my shift ended, but made sure the other security guards knew Rick's face and kept an eye on me. I worked till closing that night, So far, my new stalker hadn't returned, and we hoped that he had been embarrassed enough to just move on. But one of the guards still walked me to my car just to be safe. Jerry is a 45-year-old father of 3 who's been working security jobs for over 15 years, and he saved my life that night. We didn't see anyone, even though we were both looking hard. Everything was still and quiet. My car sat by itself. The closest vehicle to it was 3 spots away, closer to the mall, and nothing on the far end at all. But when we passed that vehicle, Rick leapt from behind it and stabbed Jerry in his side. I've never seen someone move so fast. Jerry grabbed Rick's wrist as he tried to stab him a second time, and there was a sickening snap as he broke the bone and the knife clattered to the ground. Everything happened so fast it was like a blur. Both men were screaming, but Jerry got the psycho on the ground and called for help over his radio. Everyone came running out, and 3 other guys piled on top of Rick while a 4th called 911. This is America, and we aren't filthy rich, so Jerry begged me not to call an ambulance, which I fully understood. I drove him to the hospital myself, and thankfully he's going to make a full recovery. I'd never be able to live with myself if that sweet man died trying to save me. Needless to say, he's getting a fat Christmas ham as soon as I can get the nerve to leave my house again. Rick was obviously arrested, but we're still waiting to see exactly what that process will be. I'm trying really hard not to let this actually ruin my Christmas, but it's not easy. I told my boss that I couldn't work any more shifts this year, and she was very supportive. I don't know if I'll be able to do it next year or not. I guess time will tell. But anyway, thanks for listening. I hope you all have a Merry Christmas. I like Christmas. I like advent calendars. So I found a nice one online and placed an order for it. Beginning of December rolls around. Calendar hasn't come in the mail. So I look for the order in my email to check the tracking number. There's no email. The company has no record of me placing an order. My bank doesn't have any transactions relating to the order. My husband has no memory of me buying this either. He remembers that I told him I wasn't going to be buying an advent calendar this year, which definitely not. I ordered it again, paid extra for rush shipping, and I still don't have a record of the order, despite remembering getting an email confirmation. In fact, now it doesn't even exist on the website. I've scoured all of my records, and pretty much I just need to accept I'm not going to have an advent calendar this year. Because mine got lost in the Matrix twice. When it comes to finding out that Santa Claus isn't real, I had a pretty uniquely terrifying experience. I loved Christmas. I mean, I still do, but as a child, I absolutely could not sleep on Christmas Eve. I tried to spy Santa a million times. I'd wait for my parents to go to bed and try to sneak out of my room. They'd catch me every time. Except one year, I got close. I was in 2nd grade and young for my class, so 6 or 7 years old. I recall my best friend at school saying something like, I should pretend to be asleep, then my parents will go to sleep faster, so I could sneak out to meet Santa. It would be easier. Perfect. So Christmas Eve shows up. I'm riddled with angst, and I remember my friend's advice. Pretend to be asleep. And so that's what I did. Before A Christmas Story was even over, I started to act sleepy. I don't know how great my acting skills were, but good enough to where my dad said he should just take me up to bed. I obliged and allowed myself to be carried. When my dad left the room, I think I waited just a few moments before getting out of bed to sit next to my door. I was listening for all the key indicators that the house was sleeping. What I remember is how long it took. Forever. I actually dozed off. When I woke up, The house noises had subsided. I figured my parents had been in their room for long enough and decided to make my move. Opening my door with such grace, I slid out of the doorway and started my way to the living room. A combo of tiptoeing and sliding until I eventually reached the couch. I dove into the couch, lifted the curtains, and then I sat wrapped in a blanket, peering out the window for Santa. It was snowing, and I could have sworn I heard sleigh bells, but I wasn't seeing anyone. I had a gut-wrenching thought. Maybe he'd already come. I squirmed out of the blankets and curtains, looked at the tree and the stockings. Phew, he hadn't arrived yet. As I maneuvered back under the curtains, I was shocked to see the man himself, Santa. He's walking, though. No sleigh, no reindeer. But I'm not picky. It's Santa. I realize that he's going to pass right by my house, but he's looking all over the place, at all of the houses, in all of the windows. What's he looking for? I think to myself. Then he stops in his tracks and gives another good look around at all the houses before his eyes land on me. He sees me, and I'm ecstatic. I start waving excitedly, trying so hard not to squeal. He waves back and then looks around before he starts walking toward my window. As he approaches, I notice that he's got a bag with him, and I assume it's full of presents. He mouths or whispers the phrase, "Do you want to come say hi to Santa, sweetie?" I shake my head yes, and he points to the front door. I leave the window to walk over to the door, where there's another long window that reaches the floor. I watch as Santa tries to open the door, but it's locked. I reach for the lock, unlocking the door. He tries again. From the other side of the door, I hear him say, "Okay, sweetie, you've got to unlock the other lock, the one that's on the doorknob." So I try to do what he's telling me, but for some reason I can't quite grip the lock. My little fingers keep slipping. Santa then tells me it's okay, just go to the back door. Brilliant. I scoot over to the back door and I wait for Santa. He rounds the corner and the light from the back deck turns on. Santa is fully illuminated. And I remember thinking, wow, Santa is a lot younger than I thought he was. Skinnier, too. The light seemed to scare Santa. He almost ran away until he saw me standing there. Then he proceeded to hustle toward the door, and he was telling me and motioning that I needed to be quick. He said he had something special for me, but then he had to go. He had leaned down and was reaching for something inside his bag. I unlocked the sliding door, and I pushed my hands against the glass, and I started to push the door by walking my body in the direction I needed it to open. I'll note that even today, this door is hard to open or close if at the wrong angle, but at 6 or 7, nearly impossible. Just as he turned around, I heard the door start to give way, and as soon as it had, the home was filled with the awful sound of alarms. I took my hands away from the door to plug my ears, and I looked at Santa. He looked panicked, and I noticed he was now holding some sort of rope in one hand and the bag in the other. He drops the bag and reaches for the sliding door, and he slides it open, no problem. He then reaches for me, but before I can reach back or move or anything, I'm swept up by my mom, as my dad kicks Santa square in the chest, knocking him back several feet and landing him on his backside. That's all I saw before my mom was rushing me to their bedroom and locking the door. My mom tells me that I didn't even cry at this point, which makes sense. I don't remember crying or even being terribly upset. Not until later. It was when my parents explained that the man who came to our house wasn't Santa. And my dad kept saying things like, "She still thinks he's real. Of course she tried to let the guy in." That's when I started crying. That was all while the police were there. What happened to the guy? He got away-ish. The guy took off once he gained footing. My dad didn't bother chasing him because he'd gotten the guy's wallet. The cops were also on the phone, and the guy left his bag behind. The bag wasn't filled with presents. My dad tells me it was filled with more rope, like the kind the man was holding. There was duct tape, candy, a hammer, lots of plastic bags, and miscellaneous clothes. Yeah, it's horrifying, but luckily, he was picked up just a few minutes after he left our house. Pretty hard not to spot a guy running around town dressed like Santa Claus. In the end, I forgave my parents for ruining the magic that is believing in Santa. Because, they did save my life. I visited a Costco that doesn't exist. 3 years ago, a few days after Christmas, I was hanging out at my parents' house watching National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, as one does, and my mom turned to me and said, "Hey, we're going to Costco to exchange this pots and pans set that someone gave us. This one's broken." So I was like, "Oh, cool, I've never been to a Costco before." So we all got in the car and drove about 10 minutes away to a town I've been to a million times. This town is literally down the road from my hometown, and I'd been delivering pizzas in the area for years, so I knew it like the back of my hand. We turned down a road near my doctor's office, and I remember thinking to myself, I've been here a million times and I've never seen a Costco here. But I just figured I hadn't driven down that specific road in a while, and I didn't notice or forgot. So we go in and exchange the stuff and go home. Totally normal, nothing out of the ordinary. The next day, we all went to my aunt's house for a Christmas visit, and for whatever reason at dinner, I was talking about how convenient Costco was, and that they had such cool stuff and whatever. To this day, when I drive past that road that we took, I always think to myself, I gotta remember to get a Costco membership. They had cool stuff there. But being a procrastinator, I never gotten around to it. Fast forward to 4 hours ago. I'm sitting at dinner with my parents, my brother Ian, and his fiancée Jenna. My brother is talking about the apartment he and Jenna are about to move into. Approximately 30 miles away, so nowhere near our hometown, and this is important later. And my brother says, and the best part is that there's a Costco down the road, so we can get all of our groceries in bulk. And I say, "Oh, cool. I've been thinking about getting a Costco membership for the same reason." My mom gives me a funny look and says, "Why bother? You'd have to drive all the way to Ian's apartment and back for groceries." Confused, I said, "Why? I would just go to the one in XYZ town. That's like 10 minutes away." Everyone looked at me funny and said, "There's no Costco in that town. The closest one to us is the one that Ian's talking about." So I remind them all of the time, after Christmas, that we went to exchange pots and pans. My mom tells me that A, she's never had pots and pans from Costco. B, there is no Costco in the town I was talking about. And C, that she doesn't even remember us doing anything of the sort that year. I then think back to my aunt's house, where I was talking to everyone about Costco and how I wanted to get a membership, and no one had thought anything weird about it. I said, "Guys, it's literally on the road that Dr. Whatever's office is on, down the road from there and to the left." And my dad said, "That's an abandoned strip mall back there. There hasn't been a store there since we moved up here in '96. I was so sure of myself that I said, "Are you guys ready to be more wrong than you've ever been in your entire lives?" And I pulled out my phone. I Googled Costco near me. And sure enough, the closest one is the one that Ian was talking about. Then I Googled Costco in XYZ town, and no results. We debated about this back and forth for a while. My mom said, maybe we went to Sam's Club or a BJ's that day. Those used to be around there. But I know where they both are in town, and I'm absolutely certain it wasn't either of those. I have absolutely no idea what that's all about, and I'm 100% certain I didn't dream it. My dreams are never realistic, are usually nightmares, and are very fleeting due to my medication, so I never really remember them. If anything, I'm just upset now that there's no Costco by my house and that I can't shop there. A couple of weird experiences. The first happened a few months ago. I couldn't find my house keys one evening, despite them always hanging on the hanger next to the front door. My husband, daughter, and I turned the house upside down looking for them, but nothing. My husband left me his door key and he went off to work the next morning. My daughter went to school and I went to work, arriving home about lunchtime. I let myself in the door and then went to hang my husband's key on the hook next to the door, as is my habit. I literally jumped. My keys were on the hanger. The second only happened this past weekend. My daughter, whose bedroom is in the attic, went to stay at her dad's house on Sunday, about 3 p.m. She went from there to school on Monday, then got home to my house at about 4:30 p.m. on Monday. She went straight to her room to get changed, but came flying back down the stairs with a face like thunder. "You've been in my bedroom," she yelled. I told her calmly that I hadn't. I mentioned her having the attic bedroom, as the steps are steep and I have arthritic knees, so I don't venture up there. She believed me when I told her that I hadn't. She went from furious to ashen-faced. "Why?" I asked. "There's a lit candle on my desk." Just to mention a couple of things, the candle was a small one, maybe 5 centimeters tall, and not one that could have been left burning for over 24 hours. There wasn't anything in her room that could have lit the candle. No matches, lighter, or anything. No one was home except me, and I know I didn't go up there. This is my crazy lady living in the attic story. I'm just going to start with how we found her. It was 4 a.m. and I couldn't sleep, so I got up to go to the bathroom, and I saw that the attic door was pulled down and the downstairs light was on. I stayed in my room, and the second I heard the attic door close, I opened the door to find no one there. I checked my brother's room and my parents' room, and everyone was sleeping in their beds. I woke my dad up and told him what was going on. My dad grabbed his pistol, and my mom called the police, while I had to get my brother up. Cops came quickly. They went up into the attic with my dad. They came down with a dirty, old, crazy-looking lady who had chocolate all over her face. We checked the attic and found, stowed behind a bunch of pink wall foam, one of our sleeping bags, a dirty bucket that she would clearly piss and shit in, a small flashlight, a bottle of Febreze, a small kitchen knife, and a bunch of water bottles, soda cans, protein bars. She said she lived up there for a few months. We moved all of our stuff up there in September, so the longest she could have lived here is 3 months. and she said that she got in because someone left our patio door open while we were walking our dogs. We live in a townhouse, and the patio is on the second story. So that means that she Assassin's Creeded into my house. So I don't know if she actually got in through the patio or not. She said the knife was for self-defense in case she got caught, but I'm not buying it. Besides the occasional footsteps that we assumed were just house noises, a light would be left on when we woke up every so often. We had no idea. But today I realized something. Me and my dad went up there at the end of November to get Christmas stuff. And all of our Christmas stuff was on the other side of the attic from her nest, meaning she was probably up there when we were moving stuff. And if she had had the knife, she could have easily killed us. Creepy to think about. Someone came to say Merry Christmas from the other side. So this is one of many stories I have. I never considered myself psychic or sensitive until a few years ago, when I found out stories like mine weren't common with everyone. So before I can tell the story, I have to give some background. Bear with me. My brother and I have different dads. Unfortunately, his dad passed away a year prior to when this story is set. My mom and his dad did not do well together. He wasn't a bad guy, just troubled and really didn't know how to be a good partner. My mom said that after they separated and she met my dad and got pregnant with me, my brother's dad said, "You finally got the girl you always wanted." This was something she had told him when they were together, that she always wanted a daughter, but obviously they didn't stay together to have another kid. When I was little, he was always really sweet to me, not in a creepy way, just always interested in asking how I am. My mom said that she felt like he always felt drawn to me, maybe because he regretted the end of his relationship with her, and I in some way made him think of what could have been. Who knows? Okay, so moving on to the story. A few weeks after my brother's dad died, I had a dream that I was in the hallway with him. He told me that he was okay, and he wanted to show me something. He grabbed a door handle, opened the door, and the brightest light came through. But then I woke up. I so wish I could remember what he showed me, or if he showed me anything at all. Okay, now fast forward in time. It was Christmas Eve 2009, a year later. I was upstairs in my bedroom and I heard music playing. We had a room next to mine with all kinds of toys because I had a lot of nieces and nephews that would come over. I assumed the music was coming from there, so I walked into the room to check. It was not coming from that room, and I realized it was coming from the bathroom. The bathroom? Odd, I thought. I went in there and realized the music was from a 3-tiered box. Each tier with a drawer where my mom kept jewelry and other keepsakes. As soon as I touched the box, the music abruptly stopped. I was 21 at this time, and in all the years of living with my parents, I'd never heard music come from this box, and she'd had it my entire life. I go downstairs and tell my mom the weirdest thing just happened, and I tell her the story. Her face goes completely white. She looks totally freaked out and her eyes well up with tears. She then tells me that is a jewelry box that her ex-husband, my brother's dad, who died, he gave it to her on their wedding day. She said it hasn't played music in 35 years because it broke. We even went upstairs to try to recreate the music and get it to work with no luck. I just smiled and shrugged and said, "Well, I guess he's saying Merry Christmas." I don't know why he chooses me to go through for these messages. We were not close. But I do think part of it is that he knows I won't brush things off as my brain or something weird. I feel they are from him, and he knows I'll share the message. My brother pretty much hasn't been very receptive to the messages. And I don't want to make him uncomfortable or upset him. Sorry this is so long, but I wanted to share as it's special to me. Most people here are probably aware of the story of Ed Gain. For those that aren't, he was a small-town handyman who confessed to murdering 2 women, in addition to stealing numerous bodies from their graves. One of the women that he murdered was the owner of the local hardware store, where he shot and killed her. That building still stands today. My story happened 20-plus years ago. I live in that same town, and it was just before Thanksgiving. I had already started decorating my place for Christmas, and I needed to replace some of the lights. So I just made a quick trip to the hardware store for a couple of boxes. I knew the building was rumored to be haunted by the murdered woman, but I never put much stock in it. I was in the back area where they kept the Christmas decorations and was about to grab the lights when I heard someone nearby saying something about antifreeze. I turned my head and I saw a woman walking by with a massive gunshot in her head. She then suddenly disappeared. I just stood there in shock for a good minute. When I finally made my way to the front of the store to pay for the lights, the guy behind the counter took one look at my face and simply said, "You saw her, didn't you?" When I was younger, every year for Christmas, I would drive upstate to my aunt's house, along a stretch of highway. I cannot for the life of me remember the name of this road. All I know is it runs nearby Akron, New York, at some point. However, most of the drive is through rural areas with little to no towns nearby. So it was the dead of night, and my groggy self had gotten off a long shift, and I had to drag my ass to my aunt's house since my extended family was expecting me the following morning. Near halfway through the drive, I realized I was low on gas, which irritated me. My brother told me he had filled it up the day before, so he either forgot or was straight lying. I saw an archaic-looking sign for a gas station off the next road. It wasn't an official road sign, literally a pole with a slab of metal attached to it. Gas off next exit or something along those lines, painted on it. That seemed a little sketchy, but people do the same thing with fruit stands on the highway, so whatever. I pulled off the next exit on some dilapidated country-ass road through dense woods. The whole thing was creepy and surreal. I kept expecting Leatherface to come running out of the trees with a chainsaw. Anyways, eventually I came to the gas station and realized quickly it hadn't been open for years. It was all rusted and the convenience store roof was caving in. The gas pumps had all been taken out as well. I pulled over next to it and checked my gauge. I would probably only make it another half mile before running out. So I called AAA, and they said they'd send a truck over. Now I played the waiting game. I left my engine on because when the headlights were off, everything was pitch black, and my paranoid self wasn't sitting next to an abandoned gas station in the middle of a forest in complete darkness. So most of the wait went uneventfully until I sensed movement around the side of the old store where my lights were pointed. I look up, but I didn't see anything more, so I looked back down at my phone. Then, over the sound of the night, I hear someone yell, "Hey, buddy, come here." in a demanding tone. I look up and I shit you not, there's a dude standing by the old store, looking towards me, illuminated by my headlights. He looked like a run-of-the-mill homeless guy. I was honestly spooked and figured he must have been squatting there. Still watching him, I rolled down my window and I yelled something like, "Yeah, what's up?" Still mentally crapping myself. I had my foot ready to floor it out of there at the first sight of trouble. "You got any change?" "Nah, I don't. Sorry, man." I look up at him. He has this kind of vacant expression and is standing stiff. Then I see more movement. There are heads, about 20 or so heads, peeking around the trees beyond the man that I'm talking to. I can't see them clearly at all, but they're definitely people. Literally just heads, staring in my direction from around the trees. I saw another guy beginning to walk from around the gas station, and then I turned around and sped off. I got as far away from that place as my tank could carry me, and I updated AAA on my location. The AAA driver came back over and filled me up, and I didn't say anything. But after he left, I wanted to call the cops, so I called the nearest town's sheriff department. They said they'd send a trooper over, and I gave them the location. When I got to my aunt's house, they called me back and said whoever was there was gone, but they could tell a large number of people had been living there for a while. Blankets, canned food, the usual. The whole situation still freaks me out. But frankly, I can consider myself lucky I'll always have such a creepy story to tell. I'm just glad nothing bad happened. Yeah, to the creepy dudes at the gas station, let's not meet. I read through stories here a lot and was reminded of a time when I was a kid and had a scary interaction. So it was winter time and it had snowed recently. Everything was covered in a nice, packable snow, and me and my dad were making a snowman together. I was super young in a pink snow coat and purple hat. I was obviously a child. My dad needed something from inside, or he was getting tired and decided to let me play a bit longer while he warmed up inside. So he left me outside. I'm from a super small town where everyone knows everyone, and it's pretty safe normally. And I was in sight of the kitchen window, so my parents felt safe to leave me outside for a bit of time. Apparently, this was more sketchy than anticipated. I remember rolling up snow for a snowman and a van pulling up in front of me. It looked like a white minivan with a lady in the passenger seat. They asked me if I'd seen a puppy and said that their puppy had just ran away. I can't remember what the puppy's name was, but I'm pretty sure it was something generic like Buddy or Bandit. This is where, when I think back on this, my alarm bells start ringing. The woman asked if I would like to get in their van to help look for their lost puppy, and that they really missed their dog. They asked a few times before my dad, thankfully, saw that someone was talking to me in the yard, and he asked the lady why she'd be talking to a kid alone, and the lady and whoever was in the car drove away. Unfortunately, it seems that small towns are more of a target than I would think. We had an ice cream man try to convince a few kids to get in his truck for free ice cream, a year or two after the lady lost her dog. It was already dark in the late afternoon when my brother and I arrived in the small town of Grand Rapids, Minnesota. It was December and bitterly cold. The reason for the visit was to spend Christmas with our grandma. She was well into her 90s so it was reasonable to assume each holiday would be the last. As it happened, this one was. I'm the youngest of 4 brothers. At the time, I was living in Minneapolis. My parents also lived there, but they were splitting time between Minnesota and Arizona. Currently, they were in Phoenix and hadn't planned to return to Minnesota for the holidays. Knowing our grandma would be alone, I called my brother in Chicago and suggested that he grab me so we could head up north together, where our grandma had been staying at an assisted living center. The trip was uneventful, and we had a pleasant Christmas Eve doing puzzles and chatting with our grandma. As the night came to a close, we headed to our lodgings. My brother had made the accommodations beforehand. We'd be staying at the Rainbow Inn. The motel itself was unremarkable. It wasn't old, and it didn't appear to be foreboding from outside. Our room was clean and furnished with what you'd expect: beds, a desk, some chairs, a television on a cabinet, a small bathroom. I'd call it your standard cookie-cutter roadside motel. The room was fairly small. 2 beds lay side by side, with the door at roughly the foot of one of the beds. This was the bed my brother selected, so mine was a little bit further away from the door, but only perhaps by 7 or 8 feet. The motel was mostly empty, probably due to the holiday and it being the dead of winter. After checking in, we headed down to the bar, which only had a couple of people in it. At the time, I was partial to White Russians, and I had one that evening as a nightcap. We finished our drinks and headed back to the room. We knew we had a long drive the next day. I was tired, got undressed, and flopped into my bed. My brother decided to watch TV. I wasn't interested, so I rolled over and closed my eyes. I don't remember when it started, but I want to say that it was only a few moments after I laid my head down. It was only this. The door handle suddenly began to shake, quite aggressively. I recall thinking this was strange because it didn't sound like someone had mistaken this room for theirs and simply tried to open the door. The handle was being deliberately, violently shaken. I sat up and looked out the door, and then my brother. After a couple of seconds, it stopped. We looked at each other, gave a collective shrug, and lay back down. Soon, the noise started up again. Now, I could understand someone, after a few glasses of eggnog, getting their room number wrong and trying to enter the door. But this was different. It was forceful. It was clear to me the intention was not to open the door, but instead to let the person inside know that somebody was out there. I thought perhaps it was kids playing a prank. I hadn't seen anyone in the motel, and it was well past 11 p.m., so it seemed odd that any children would be allowed to roam the halls. I got up and walked over to the door. We had heard no voices, no giggles, no closing doors, and no retreating footsteps. I looked out the door's peephole, which gave a decent view of the hallway, but I saw no one. I opened the door and leaned out. Our room was near the center of the hall, so I could see the exits on both ends. I recall there was a hallway that split off perhaps 20 feet down my left. I assumed this is where the pranksters retreated to, as there wouldn't be enough time for them to run the entire hallway and out one of the exits, or to enter a room without us hearing the door to another room close. I looked for some other explanation. Was the door itself somehow causing the sound? Was it loose and perhaps the wind or the pressure of the structure was making it shake? I closed the door and pushed it. It was very solid. I couldn't replicate the sound, except by grabbing the handle and vigorously shaking it. This was getting annoying. I was tired and I just wanted to sleep. I climbed back into bed, but I lay there like a coiled spring, waiting for whoever was pranking us to return. I'd enjoy catching them in the act if they did. Soon enough, moments later, the shaking started up again. I sprung up and was at the door in an instant. I looked out the peephole again, certain to see some kids running down the hall. But I saw no one. From the time the noise stopped to the time I was at the door was a couple of seconds at most. The only way I couldn't have seen or heard someone was if they were smart enough to crouch down, knowing that I couldn't see anything directly under the peephole. I opened the door. No one was there. No one had been there. My brother and I are both skeptics. We were certain there was a reasonable explanation for this, but truth be told, I was beginning to get a little spooked. I had never experienced anything like this. It seemed to defy logic. Once again, I crawled into bed, but I was so unnerved, sleep seemed out of the question. I was upset I hadn't caught the pranksters, but was also dimly aware that there were none to be caught. Something was making this happen. Something unseen. Someone with a purpose. It scared me. I recall making a conscious decision to will the noise to stop. I closed my eyes tightly and focused on the thought. I don't want this to happen anymore. Enough. You've made your point. Whatever it might have been. Stop now. And it did. The door rattler didn't return. After a while, I relaxed a little. My brother shut off the TV and turned out the lights. The silence of the room was complete. However, as the night wore on, I found myself woken up by other noises. I could hear the door chain moving. I could hear other unidentifiable sounds at the door. I didn't hear the door handle again, but all through the night, I was subjected to the repeated sounds of the door being fiddled with in some manner. A pattern emerged. I'd hear a sound, become terrified, it would stop, and I'd drift off to sleep again. In the morning, my brother and I discussed what might have happened. All he would say was that we had visitors, and in the bright light of day, it all seemed a bit silly. What it might have been seemed not very important. I just wanted to go home. We checked out of the motel and got on the road. Several hours later, we approached Minneapolis, the skyline looming in the distance. Not long after that, my brother dropped me off at my apartment, and he carried on to Chicago. As I shifted back into my life, I placed the incident behind me, and aside from telling a few close friends, I simply moved on. A few months passed, and I went to visit my oldest brother, who was living in Arizona. Years before, he'd lived in Grand Rapids and knew the Rainbow Inn, although he'd never stayed there. I told him the story. All the while, he smiled at me as I related the story. It was a knowing smile that I at first mistook for disbelief. When I was done, he told me that our other brother, the one that I'd been with at the motel, had recently visited and related the same story to him. I did not know this. He said that our stories were essentially identical. I'd not spoken to him since he'd dropped me off at my apartment. The next thing he said chilled me. As I've mentioned, he'd lived in Grand Rapids years before and naturally was very familiar with the town. He told me the Rainbow Inn, the place I found so plain and average, had a history of hauntings. I assume he'd gotten this information from the locals he encountered while living there years ago. While my oldest brother likes to joke and tease, he is for the most part a stoic Midwesterner, not given to nonsense or deception. I believe him. Now, obviously, if I had been aware of this beforehand, and the events of that night had played out as they had, I'd no doubt believe that it was our imagination that were to blame. But the fact that this motel was so unassuming, the location so mundane, and the building so very unremarkable leads me to believe that whatever happened that night was not something that had simply sprung from our imaginations. I'm still a skeptic. I like to think this could be explained without resorting to the supernatural. What I do know is this: it was real. It was terrifying, and I'll never forget this experience. My husband, our children, and I have lived in the same home for almost 4 years now. The home was originally built in 1906. At the time this story takes place, we were remodeling our kitchen and bathroom. About 2 years ago, my little brother came to visit for a couple of weeks around Christmas. He was sleeping in the living room, which was probably 50 feet away from our bedroom. The second night he was there, around 3:30 in the morning, I wake up to him shaking me and standing on my side of the bed with a Mountain Dew and a bottle of water. He scared the holy hell out of me. Freaked out, I asked him what in the actual funk he was doing. He said, "What do you mean? You asked me to bring these to you." Confused, I said, "Wait, what? No, I didn't." He said, "Yes, you did. You yelled across the house for me to bring these to you." I was a little confused, but thought maybe I was yelling in my sleep and dropped it. The next day, I yelled out to him from my room while folding laundry. I yelled for him multiple times, and he never came in there. So I went to him in the living room and was like, "Really, dude? I've been calling you for 5 minutes." And he said he couldn't hear me, which really made me question the other night. A couple of nights later, around the same time, I wake up to screaming. I jump out of bed and start running toward the screaming. As I get out of our room into the hallway, my little brother is standing outside my door, crying, hyperventilating. I started panicking, like, what's going on? And he tells me that he woke up to get something to drink, walked back to the living room, and when he laid back down on the couch, I was standing at the foot of the couch, just staring at him. He said, "Dude, what are you doing?" And the figure that looked like me didn't answer, so he said my name 3 more times and asked what I was doing again. And it still didn't answer, but instead threw her head forward and looked at him, and then turned to the right and ran into the den. He said the figure was wearing the same clothes I was wearing, but her face was horrible and distorted. He was terrified and told me that he didn't want to stay at our house anymore. So he went to my mom's and stayed there for the rest of the time he was here. Now, nothing has ever happened to me in my house. My kids said some things have happened to them, but I just chalked it up to kids being kids until the other night. I was home alone and decided to take a bath. I get out of the bath and get dressed, and as I go to grab the doorknob to leave, I looked back into the mirror, and on the left side of my face was a woman's face, completely tore up, like cuts everywhere. She had gray hair and was wearing a robe with a nightgown underneath. I was so shocked I couldn't move. I went to turn and run out of the bathroom, but nothing. I couldn't move, and all of a sudden, in my left ear, I hear a whisper and a woman's voice say, "You're the only one that understands." I finally could move and ran out of the bathroom, straight outside, and called my husband. I'm still kind of freaked out by it, and if I have to go into the bathroom, I leave the door open. Nothing has happened since, and I'm really hoping nothing else does happen, because that was scary. I have noticed that it's any time we're remodeling or changing anything in the house that something paranormal starts happening. The day before this happened to me in the bathroom, we had finished putting new hardwood in the hallway. Back in 1996, I got a tent house for Christmas. Basically, it's a plastic sheet with windows cut into it, held up by a frame. I used to play in it a lot, and in the end, my mom had to take it out of my bedroom because she would find me playing in it at 2 a.m. One morning, while my mom was giving me breakfast, I told her about the little boy that lived in the tent house. I told her how we would play at night and how he would get angry if I tried to sleep. So my mom, being pretty creeped out, took the tent house down and she put it in the garden, and I never spoke about him again. So basically a child's imagination. A funky tent house is easily explained, right? Well, in 2017, I was house sitting while she was away. In the early hours on a Wednesday morning, I woke up a bit groggy in my old bedroom. I stood in front of the window, looking out to the garden, and for a moment, in the darkness, I'm sure I saw a little boy waving from the garden. I put it down as tiredness or anything else, as I was rather spooked. The following day, I go into the garden to smoke, last night's thoughts still running around in my head. And in the corner of the garden, under trash bags and gardening tools, was my old tent house. My grandma died of emphysema when I was 3. The only memory I have of her is visiting her in the hospital and seeing her hooked up to a breathing tube. When she spoke to tell me that she loved me, the sound terrified me, and I ran to my mother and cried. After she died, my aunt gave me a small teddy bear in an angel outfit that said, "When you squeezed it." Even though it sounds creepy, I always thought it was cute. Anyway, years later, when I was a teenager, I had a dream about her, which had never really happened before since I didn't really know her. I woke up to get ready for school, and as I was walking to my closet, I kept thinking about the dream. The left side of the closet had my clothes hanging, and the right side was filled with old boxes of stuff like holiday decorations and other random stuff. As soon as I open the door to the closet, I hear, I froze. I didn't even know the bear was in the boxes. I'd honestly forgotten about it. No one had touched those boxes for months. I would have expected the batteries to be dead because at that point, it was like a 10-year-old bear. There was no possible way for the bear to be squeezed by anything hard enough to make the sound. That was the first and last time I ever heard it while it was in the box. Right after I saw her in my dream. Initially, I was creeped out, but I quickly realized it was just her way of telling me she's watching over me and she loves me. I think about it sometimes and tear up. It's the only unexplained thing that's ever happened to me, and I'm glad it was a positive one. My parents bought their home in the early 50s for $18,000 in California. My dad was extremely proud that it came furnished. What a deal. My dad was all about the bargains. His favorite piece was a wall unit made of dark woods that had a grandfather-type clock built in the center. My dad babied that unit as if it were a family member, cleaning and polishing it regularly, even talking to it. Don't misunderstand, he was brilliant. microelectronic engineer, a genius, really. But fast forward to 1992, 2 days before Christmas, he suddenly dies of a massive heart attack, his second, in the living room. My mom grieves horribly for a very long time. We began talking to her about redecorating, using her inheritance from my dad to make the home her own. She finally agreed, and soon after, the house was filled with workers. I happened to be visiting when I believe my dad voiced his opinion about the changes. A worker was looking to remove the family member unit from the wall. He thought my mom was nearby, so he loudly asked, "Hey, you want this clock unit removed?" He stated he heard a very loud affirmative, "No." So he didn't remove that piece. Later, my mom came through the room and noticed the only item left in the room was that piece. She asked the contractor, whom I'd been chatting with, why this piece was still on the wall. He left to speak with his workers, came back and said, "My guy said that you said no very loudly. Is that correct?" My mom responded, "He didn't ask me. I've been outside in the laundry room and backyard all morning." I truly believe it was my dad. He was angry at the thought that his beloved clock might be replaced or removed. It's a favorite family story to this day. When I was around the age of 5, I received a life-size doll for Christmas. On the box, the doll was called the Wispy Walker doll. It was about the same height as me, with blonde hair and overalls. The strangest part about this gift was that no one could recall who got me this doll, as it was labeled from Santa. Even years later, when I asked my family who got me the doll, no one could remember who. I instantly did not like the doll because it freaked me out. I left the doll in the back of my closet, far away from all of my other toys. Years passed and the doll remained in the back of my closet, untouched. When I was about 7 years old, I began to play hide and seek with my mom in our home. I decided to hide behind the door in my bedroom, which is right in front of my closed closet door. I gasp when I come to find the Wispy Walker doll out of her box, placed behind my bedroom door, with one eye open and another shut. I scream and run for my mom, crying. I tell her, "Mom, Big Sis is playing a prank on me and put the walking doll behind my door to scare me." My mother, confused, explains that my sister had left for camp that morning with her class. My mom walks over to check behind the door, and there was no doll. My stomach drops, and I'm at a loss for words. "Maybe you're just seeing things," my mom told me. We opened the closet to check if the doll is inside the closet. It was, but outside of its box, just standing next to it. I had never taken the doll out of its original packaging. I eventually got rid of the doll, but every time I remember this story, I get chills. I grew up in a very small, rural yet scenic town. You know, the kind that lays dormant until warm weather brings cottagers and tourists. The summer I was 18, I was involved with a guy, we'll call him Jack, who had a lake house nearby. I'm 22 now and I haven't seen him since. The summer that I was 20, I lived and worked in the city I'd moved to for college. I avoided my hometown, which was 3 hours away by car, at the time, only going back briefly that year for Christmas. But one day, I got a random text from Jack. "Hey, it was great catching up with you today. I'd love to hang out sometime, like you suggested." Smiley face. "When did you say you were off?" It took a while to explain to him that I hadn't spent more than 72 consecutive hours in that town in almost a year. Apparently, I had called his name back when he called mine from across the street. We talked about the old days, and I'd given him a brief life update. And what I had said about what I was up to these days included some information that he had no way of knowing. For the record, this wasn't the only time someone claimed to have seen me in my hometown while I was gone. It's just the most memorable. Several years ago, I was at my cousin's house for a Christmas party. She and her husband host one every year for his family on Christmas Eve. And it's basically a tradition that I show up and that I stick around to help clean up, and then we watch Griswold's Christmas Vacation before I make the drive to my parents' house, which was about an hour from where they lived. My cousin's property sat on a greenbelt, basically just woods and wetlands behind their house. It's like a protected area where no one was able to build anything on, but you were able to enjoy it for what it was. I'd only ever explored the area when walking our dogs out there during the day. We would normally walk through the man-made trails until those turned into mush, and we'd have to head back the way we came. The houses around their home were pretty spread out from one another. So where it's possible to see someone, I never had. Not until that Christmas Eve, 6 years ago. We'd finished cleaning, watching the movie, and I knew I had to leave soon if I didn't want to physically fall asleep while driving to my parents'. Before doing so, I knew I also needed to take my dog out. I asked my cousin's husband to go with me, but he was half asleep on the couch, just telling me to stick to the backyard area and I'd be fine. My cousin sort of rolled her eyes at this, and she told me to hang on, that she'd grab their dog and we'd all go out together. Almost immediately after opening the door, my dog ran off into the darkness. I called after him, as did my cousin, but within moments her dog was chasing after mine, headed for the woods. My cousin grabs a flashlight off the back deck, and we take off after the dogs. We reach the green belt, and we notice that our dogs were just standing there, waiting for us. We continued into the woods, and though it was dark, nothing seemed off upon entering. As we were getting closer to the area that turns to mush, my cousin and I stopped, and we were talking about her husband, joking that he would feel really bad if we got murdered out here. We joked like this because there was no reason to be afraid of the area, so it seemed appropriately funny. But then, we noticed our dogs. They both froze at the same time. They were just ahead of us now, but they were stopped dead in their tracks, ears and tails pointed. Sometimes they did this, usually when some sort of critter had caught their attention. But this time was different. Their pointed tails began to soften, and now they stood there with their tail between their legs, whining. My dog was whining, but he was also shaking. Both of the dogs were shaking, but why? My cousin's dog began to let out a low growl, and just before she called out to her, I grabbed my cousin's arm. I'd heard something. We stood there, not saying a word to one another, just staring, with the flashlight dimmed and facing our feet. We were sure that we were hearing what our dogs were hearing. People in the woods. My cousin switched the light off entirely, but we could still see a glow. It was coming from further inside the woods, definitely through the mush. What we were hearing, it seemed like animal squeals, but the predominant sound was voices. They were close, but it didn't seem like they were speaking English, as we couldn't make out what they were saying. As we edged closer to the mush where our dogs were, we each grabbed onto them and stood a moment longer, chanting in unison. Even though what they were chanting was incomprehensible, it made the hairs on all of our bodies stand up straight. And it only got louder. Before we noticed the figures accompanying these voices were getting closer to us, our dogs did. They were now both growling and taking a protective stance. We couldn't see any faces, just shadows, a large group of them, possibly wearing all black, or it was just too dark to see them. But there were these balls that looked like fire, or bright lights that were pulsating like fire. That's when we collectively decided to get the heck out of there. Assuming whoever these people chanting were had already noticed our presence, we didn't bother exiting quietly. So we yanked on our dogs' collars and called, or yelled rather, for them to follow us as we ran. As we rushed into the house, we made a shit ton of noise, and there was my cousin's husband, being awoken from his slumber on the couch by my cousin yelling that we almost got murdered out there. I was standing there just trying to catch my breath. The dogs both stood at the back door, growling out the window. My cousin was explaining what happened out there, and I just looked out the window with the dogs. I turned off the porch light and just watched. You could see a faint glow, even now. Something maybe we'd initially dismissed as lights on a home in the distance. What is the glowing? Torches? I asked out loud, specifically to my cousin's husband. This actually got him off the couch, where he came to see what I was referring to. After a while, he told me that it was probably somebody having a fire in their backyard. At 2 a.m, I argued. He replied saying that he'd seen and heard of weirder things. Instead of trying to convince him that something was seriously off about those lights, I started to pack my goods to hit the road. I'd never been so eager to leave my cousin's house. Just a few minutes into this task, and I hear, "What the f—" My cousin rushes to the window where her husband is standing to see what he's seeing. I walk into the room and I can see through the window. Now lining a portion of the green belt are 6, 7, 8 torches. Open flames. They appear to be being held by someone because they're not touching the ground. My cousin's husband runs off. I can only assume to grab a gun or something. But my cousin doesn't move. She gestures for me to come closer to look. Do you see any faces? Like, do you think they're wearing masks or something? I honestly didn't know. I couldn't see very well at all, but I wasn't sure it mattered what they were wearing. Isn't this trespassing? I asked it out loud even though I thought I knew the answer, and I suggested that we call the cops. We don't need the cops. These people just need to get the fuck off our property. My cousin's husband made his way to the back door. He had a shotgun in his hand. As he opened the back door, the torches or lights extinguished simultaneously. Now it's nothing but pitch black. I hear my cousin's husband let out a frustrated type of grunt as he makes his way back inside to grab something else. He appears again with several lights in his hands. I have no idea what he's about to do, but I need to get on the road. I'm telling my cousin that I'm going to continue packing as I need to hit the road. She tells me she understands, and just then, I see the entire backyard light up, all the way toward and into the greenbelt. Her husband had 5 different heavy-duty floodlights illuminating the entire area. if anyone was there, we'd spot them. But we saw no one. As I headed to my car, both of them walked me out, and I suggested one last time that they call the cops. Part of me felt bad leaving them, but what was I going to do that the cops wouldn't be able to do? It was a strange Christmas. I rang it in by interrupting something really unsettling in the woods, and then driving alone that night. I kept wishing I'd thought to record it, if for no other reason than to see if I could figure out what they were all saying. Either way, I practically kissed the sidewalk when I got to my parents' house. Something about sleeping in my old bed felt extra safe that night. My cousin and her husband continued to live in this house for a couple of years. Not without issue, though. They kept finding dead animals on their property. Usually a bird, sometimes a rabbit. Always in the same area. Always at the edge of their property, on the greenbelt. Towards the end of them living there, several neighbors had complained about the same activity in the woods. Loud chanting, but no one was sure of the source. People thought they saw fires. But even when the police were called out to the area, they never actually found anyone out there. This made my cousin and my husband uneasy, knowing that it wasn't one of their neighbors or their kids messing around, and that the police were clueless. They decided to put the house up for sale, and it sold quickly. They were surprised, but I was surprised it took them so long to make that choice. That experience ruined our Christmas tradition for a good 2 years because I refused to go back there. It's like what we saw, what I felt out there, it was far from normal. My brother has shared this story a few times, more than a few times. He's usually the one to bring it up every Christmas. I was a bit younger than him, as it was in 2003. He was 16 at the time, but I was 11. It always made me feel a bit unsettled, and the rest of my family, too. Whenever he would bring it up, my mom would give him that look, and my grandparents, well, they would tell him to stop talking about the weird stuff. But it was weird, and it should have been talked about. Or at least, I understood why my brother would want to talk about it. So here it is. Christmas Day, 2003. It's myself, my brother, my mom, my dad, and my grandparents. We'd finished dinner, but we were still at the table. The adults playing cribbage at one end, while my brother and I had started a speed tournament at the other end of the table. In my brother's version of the story, nothing weird happens yet. But for me, while in the middle of a game of speed, I just stopped playing. Something was happening to my hearing. I had experienced something like it before, maybe when wearing headphones, but it felt most like when they tested your hearing in school. The moment they put those big headphones on, it almost muted everything around you. I remember in this moment, trying to pop my ears, like I was taught to do on an airplane or climbing elevation when we drive somewhere like our cabin in Eastern Washington. Before I could explain what I was experiencing, and before anyone could even tell that something was wrong with me, a bright, very intense blue light filled the entire home. It was hard to tell if it was something that happened quickly or if it took time. I recall it entering from the ceiling and then filling all of the walls down to the floors, and then disappearing entirely. It seemed like it had come from inside the house. The windows, the curtains, they were closed. With the light gone, my brother was now standing, looking around wildly. I still couldn't really hear anything. Some, but not a lot. He looked excited, running over to the window. My parents, they looked worried, and my grandparents looked confused. My brother was opening the curtains, turning back and saying something to everyone. I finally spoke out, said that I couldn't hear anything. But I could hear the voice in my head. My mom looked at me, grabbed my head and sort of moved it side to side, as though she was looking for an injury. Being closer to her, I could almost make out sound. I could tell she was saying, "Try to pop your ears." I had tried this. It wasn't working. I just looked at my dad now, who seemed to be asking my brother to come back to the table, gesturing to close the curtains. I looked and it was dark out there. But didn't anyone else see that it seemed to come from above us and not from outside? My brother was walking back to the table when he froze. We all froze. The brightest white light filled the room. It was so bright that my eyes actually felt like maybe they were burning. It looked like I was inside of the sun or a light bulb itself. I couldn't see my family. I couldn't see anything directly in front of me or to the side. And then I could. Everything was back to normal. The lighting. We were all sort of looking around. Being 11 at the time, I don't know how long we all talked about it that night, but we certainly didn't have any answers or resolution by the time we moved on to dessert. My brother especially couldn't let it go. He was sure that my dad or grandpa had some sort of theories. While talking about it, my mom said that she'd seen what I'd seen. A light from the ceiling make its way down. My dad didn't think anything of it, and my grandparents assumed it was coming from outside. Could have been Christmas lights, my grandpa actually said. My brother said that we were all wrong, that it was coming through all of the walls, through the ceiling, through us. He said he saw the light fixate on the area of the garage where my dad keeps his guns. Not the ones that he uses, but the ones that he collects. He told my dad that he didn't believe him. He thought that he'd seen it stop and scan there too. I remember that being the end of it for that year, though. My dad basically shutting my brother down, saying that he had a wild imagination and that it was just a couple of flashes of light. Well, there was a woman my brother ended up doing some contracting work for several years later. She lived in the same area that we grew up. And when I say that my brother didn't let go of this, I mean it. So him being him somehow got to talking to this woman about our Christmas in 2003. Not only did she know what my brother was talking about, but told him that while all she saw were 2 flashes of light, her daughter had come running in from outside, saying that she'd seen a bright blue light, almost like a laser, just scanning the whole property, the whole house. She said it spent a lot of time scanning their house, that it didn't appear to be coming from anything except for the dark sky itself. As soon as it stopped, she ran for the door, and then there was a long, bright, white flash. Basically, I don't discount what my brother says. I also don't discount what anyone else says, because somehow, some way, my whole family all experienced something at the same time, but it was different for all of us. And based on what my brother has discovered through pure persistence, it's not just his imagination that is wild, it's the whole situation. Growing up, it was just me and my mom, and she always made a big deal out of Christmas. Not so much the gifts, but The decorations, the Christmas crafts, the baking, the toy drives, stuff like that. One of my favorite traditions was making special cookies for Santa on Christmas Eve. We would leave them on the mantle of the fireplace with a glass of milk. Then, I would wake up and be delighted that Santa ate most of the cookies, but he'd also left one for me and one for my mom. One year, I was probably 8. A bit too old to believe in Santa, maybe, but the magic was alive and well within me, and I couldn't wait to get up and eat that cookie. But on this Christmas, there was no cookie. There was no plate, even. Had my mom already moved it and eaten her cookie? I looked around the house, and it didn't look like she was awake, but the lights were on in the living room and in the kitchen. I walked back to her bedroom and could see that she was still sleeping. I didn't see any cookies near her either, but I shook her awake anyways, asking her, what the heck? She woke up a bit confused and then was excited, telling me Merry Christmas and asking me, where's the cookies? Now I looked confused. I looked back out in the living room. I told her plain and simple. Santa took our cookies, and he took our plate too. He even took the cup. My mom didn't look confused any longer. She looked scared. At the time, I wasn't sure if she was angry or scared, but I knew it wasn't good. She got up rather quickly, went into the living room. Then I saw her checking all the windows, all the doors, to see if they were locked. She did this in all of the rooms, and at the time I really didn't understand why. Eventually, she seemed to calm down and told me that she wasn't sure why Santa would have done that. Otherwise, it was a really normal Christmas. It wasn't until maybe 2 years later when I learned that, spoiler alert, Santa was nothing more than a myth, that it dawned on me. If Santa wasn't real, why did my mom throw away our Christmas cookie stuff? That was like my favorite part. Well, when I asked her, she told me that she didn't throw anything away. In fact, she woke up as she normally did in the middle of the night, ate a few cookies, poured out the milk, and put everything back in its place, and expected it all to be there, just like I did. She told me that to this day, she has no idea what happened that night. She was terrified, but tried to make Christmas normal for me. She even joked about how she thought she was going to have to tell me Santa wasn't real and head to the police station that year. The thing is, nothing was unlocked when she checked. Nothing was broken. At least not that either one of us was aware of. Yet, the tray and its contents were completely missing, without a trace. So, what do you think happened that Christmas? Glitch in the Matrix? Or a good old-fashioned home invasion?